Okay. Johnny Appleseed by Stephen Vincent and Rosemary Carr Benet. One thing that I want to point out before we get going here is the rhyming pattern of this poem. So a lot of the times with poetry, if you look through the stanzas, at the last word, before you get started, you can see if there's a rhyming pattern. And what we see in this is that the first and third line of every stanza do not rhyme, but the second and fourth one do rhyme. One reason why I'm pointing that out is because when you're reading it for the first time and you're unfamiliar with some words, but you know that they're rhyming the second and fourth lines of the stanza, it might help you figure out how to pronounce a word. For example, in this stanza, it says, "A fine old man as ripe as a pippin, his heart was still light and his steps still skippin'." So if you weren't sure if this was supposed to be pipin' or what it was, looking at those two words gives you an idea of how it's intended to be said. So, without further ado, let's talk about some vocabulary before we get started here. So in the second stanza, it says he was gnarled as could be, meaning twisted, but ruddy and sound. So his body was pretty rough. His hands were pretty worn out and all that kind of stuff. He may have walked bent over a little bit. That's the kind of twisting we're talking about. But ruddy means healthy. So even though his body was pretty rough shape, he seemed healthy and mentally sound. He was able to keep ticking as far as his brain was concerned. When we go down to the 5th stanza, we've got the word Ashtabula, which is a city in Ohio. Fort Wayne is a city in Indiana. Then it says he planted and pruned and he planted again. So pruned, when we're talking about it here, we're talking about trimming trees. In the next stanza, it says he had not a hat to encumber his head. Encumber meaning restrict. Down here, root, and knew all his orchard, root, tendril, and blossom. So you'll hear a lot of the times, girls especially will know this term as a tendril or a curl, right? So a tendril on a plant is the long, skinny, leafless stem that plants grow, and it's used for support. And so plants that often have tendrils would be trees like apple trees, but grape trees, that kind of thing, because they are used to help support. Then in the 8th stanza right here, we've got, it says, a fine old man as ripe as a pippin. So I will admit I had to look this one up. A pippin is a crisp, tart apple, usually yellow or greenish yellow with red on it, and it's typically used for cooking. And then we have lair, the beast in its lair, meaning like a cave, right? And I think everything else you should be okay with. So let's go ahead and read the poem. Of Jonathan Chapman, two things are known: that he loved apples, that he walked alone. At 70 odd, he was gnarled as could be, but ruddy and sound as a good apple tree. For 50 years over, of harvest and dew, he planted his apples where no apples grew. The winds of the prairie might blow through his rags, but he carried his seeds in the best deerskin bags. From old Ashtabula to frontier Fort Wayne, he planted and pruned, and he planted again. Keep in mind the rhyming. He had not a hat to encumber his head. He wore a tin pan on his white hair instead. He nested with owls and with bear cub and possum, and knew all his orchards, root, tendril, and blossom. A fine old man, as ripe as a pippin, his heart still light, and his steps still skippin'. The stalking Indian, the beast in its lair, did no hurt while he was there. For they could tell, as wild things can, that Jonathan Chapman was God's own man. Why did he do it? We do not know. He wished that apples might root and grow. He has no statue, he has no tomb. He has his apple trees still in bloom. Consider, consider, think well upon the marvelous story of Appleseed John.